welcome. Weekly Q&A for High Calling Fitness. We've got several excellent topics today. So related to performance, strength, injuries, etc. We had a great question from David today, especially with regards to hypertrophy, about low volume versus high volume. Now, for those of you that are strength athletes that are listening in, you understand volume in a way that to me makes the most rational sense, right? Which is literally the tonnage that you move when you're using a weight. I don't know why we use the word volume in bodybuilding when that's not what we mean. But in bodybuilding, volume is a word that is used for something that's multifactorial. Okay, so here's sort of where the issue lies. The question always comes up, what's best for hypertrophy in bodybuilding? And it's always the high volume versus low volume argument. And so you've got the Mike Mentzers and the Dorian Yates, sort of your, HIT and blood and guts, right? Versus sort of your typical bro split, right? Now, the first thing I want to say is there is a vast spectrum of bodybuilding methods between those two extremes, okay? And so what I would say is if your programming and protocols are flip-flopping between this extreme and this extreme, that's probably something that needs a little bit of management, right? Because it's going to be pretty individual. So let's talk about volume as it relates to bodybuilding. So I said it was multifactorial. Here are the factors. Volume actually refers to three things. It refers to workout volume, which most sane people would call frequency, but we call it volume in bodybuilding for whatever reason. So workout volume, how many workouts you're doing per week. Set volume, how many sets you're doing per body part. And then, of course, you have multi-factor sets when you're doing smaller muscles. You have partial sets. And then rep volume as well, okay? And so there's when somebody goes, what do you think about high volume? I'm like, well, I guess it depends on what you mean, right? And this is the part where it matters, because the reality is you can go, I do low volume, and you might be saying, I take one set to failure. Well, are you doing 30 reps during one set? Because I would consider that fairly high volume with regards to repetition range, right? While it's very low set volume. And are you doing a set for that body part 4 times a week? Because I would consider that high volume versus low volume, right? Just from the sheer, stimulus factor. And so here's the way to sort of crack this nut without getting injured. And injuries happen on both sides. I'm going to tell you how it happens. On the sort of blood and gut side, here's what happens. When you develop muscle, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit just on the cellular structures of muscle, about a different question we're going to answer. But when you develop muscle, there's a couple things that happen. You build more sarcomeres, you lengthen sarcomeres, and most importantly, you build cross sections in muscles that attach along the length of the muscle belly and at the insertions. What that does is it effectively shortens the range of a muscle and builds the muscle size. So it not only contributes to size, but also the strength of the muscle, the ability to move weight, okay? That's what's happening on a cellular level. Now, the stimulus it takes to create that growth is going to be individual, and it is not individual based on the volume itself, but rather the recovery capabilities of the person doing the workout. So here's why I say that. In my workout, for example, okay, I have a ton of chest volume, something like 8 sets, 2-3 exercises, 8 sets per workout. Now, that is a lot of volume for the chest. But for my triceps, I only do 3 sets ever. That's it. And I take them very close to failure. And they're somewhere between the 15-20 rep range, where my bench always stays between 5 and 10. Okay, whether it's incline dumbbell, whether it's barbell bench, it doesn't matter. Okay. And if you've seen my stories on Instagram, you know that I'm really low volume on chest work as far as rep volume, okay, but I'm very high set volume. And the reason is because my chest can take a lot of work and it can recover from a lot of work, whereas my triceps just get blown out and they're sore for days if I do anything more than about 3-4 sets. Okay. Not to mention my elbows begin to hurt. I have joint problems, wrists begin to hurt. It's just sort of there's a multi-factor thing there. But my recovery capabilities are not amazing intra workout for my triceps. However, I can only work my chest twice a week because that's how often it recovers. I can work my triceps every single day. They will recover from that volume every single day. And so it's really individual based on the person, the set volume, rep volume, and even the workout frequency, which we could also call volume, right? That's necessary for growth. Now, this also has a couple of factors. You have the genetic factor, and most of you don't have to worry about that because you are right at the top of the bell curve. Very few of you are outliers, so don't freak out. You don't have to have special genetics, okay? And you're probably not cursed with terrible genetics or anything like that either. You're probably right in the center, which is great, okay? But your muscles are so individual in the sense of how they create cross-sectional strands at the insertions and along the muscle belly. And it is also individual as to whether or not your sarcomeres lengthen first or add volume first within the muscle. So you might look at somebody with a really strong bicep peak and you go, wow, they have an amazing peak. It's genetic. Actually, what's genetic is they're adding more sarcomeres to that chain, and it makes the muscle belly do this, right? It makes it more 3D. Whereas somebody with a longer muscle belly, right, might actually have a bigger bicep by and large. They probably do, okay? But it doesn't appear real peaky and 3D like that bicep, right? And so the person who has volume, correct. The person who has that sort of peakier bicep that adds more sarcomeres, here's the reality. The person that adds more sarcomere volume to the bicep is going to be able to handle more volume in the gym because they actually have more cellular structures for mechanical power than someone who has a longer sarcomere, okay, that is just filling the muscle belly. Now, neither is inferior to the other. It's just a thing. It's just the way people are built, okay? And so you may see a guy going in there and doing really heavy loads with biceps, really big, strict barbell curls. And he's doing, 5, 6, 7, 8 sets for biceps, and he's just killing it. And you go, man, if I did that, my biceps would rip right off the bone. You go, all I can handle is like some incline dumbbell curls, and my muscles feel like they're going to tear. Well, that's probably because you have a longer muscle, right, versus one with more sarcomere chains. And so cellularly, that's what happens in the muscle. Outside the muscle, you may also be in a situation where your muscle actually physically lengthens when it stretches versus building cross-sectional pieces of muscle that effectively shorten the total range of the muscle all the way down the belly into the insertion. Here's why that's important. You may find that when you get to the bottom of a curl, you feel incredibly weak until you get about halfway up, right? Whereas some folks may get to the bottom of a curl and it may feel like the turbo just hit. They're like, man, once they're in that stretch reflex, they can just yank that thing up. And that is a function of muscle length versus cross-sectional power in the arm. Now, I'm going to give you a better example of that that's a little more relatable in the real world. Women have real difficulties doing strict pull-ups. That is not because they are weak. They're light enough to do them. They certainly can be strong enough to do them. For sure, they may have a really good lat pull down. They may have strong rows. And all the muscles in the back, and especially the big muscles in the lat, may be very well developed. Here's the problem. They do not develop cross sections at the insertion of the lat the same way that men do. And men are born with cross sections at the insertion of the bottom of the lat that forces the scapula to retract when you pull your elbows to your side. If you're a male, try to keep your scapula depressed and pull your elbows to your side. It's impossible. You're going to retract your scapula. Women can do that. They can pull their elbows to their side and depress their scapula. Okay, why is that important? Well, because women have a longer muscle length in the lat, it is harder to pull up. And so they have to do negatives to build that cross-sectional muscle by causing muscle damage on the way down. Okay. Whereas men can sort of pop up there and kind of do a pull up or two, right? Even if they've never done it, because they've got that cross-sectional power already. Okay. So the amount of power that you have, the amount of weight you can do, the amount of reps you can do, the amount of sets that you can stand also has a lot to do with how strong the muscle is in that length of position based on how many cross-sectional pieces it has in the cellular structure. And so volume-wise, here's how you get hurt. If you go, I'm going to do blood and guts, okay? I'm doing Dorian Yates. Cool. When you get to a muscle that, yes, when you get to a muscle that lengthens real well, when you go blood and guts and you go to negative failure, when you go to eccentric failure, you're going to pop a muscle. Here's the muscle you're most likely going to pop is something like your bicep, okay? Right at probably closely, you may not tear your bicep tendon, but you may get a big tear in the belly right in the center or a big pull. You are definitely going to pop your semimembranosus if you're deadlifting, doing blood and guts for sure. That's that big center piece of the hamstring that comes out when you bend over. That thing will pop. Absolutely. It is a strong muscle, but you cannot over fatigue it with that blood and gut style training. It will pop. And so you're going to pop a hamstring, you'll pop a bicep. Okay. And so you have to take that low volume recommendation and go, well, I feel like I recover better from it, and adjust it up slightly. You don't have to do one set to complete failure. You can do 2 sets to within a rep or 2 of failure, and that's probably adequate, and you're less likely to get injured even if you're doing heavies across the board, okay? And so if you're doing that blood and guts, it's that eccentric failure that they push in that system that causes the injuries. You are going into a position where the muscle gets damaged. That's actually the whole purpose of it, right? And your muscle spindles are going to create a strong stretch reflex at some point when you negatively fail. And if the stretch reflex is strong enough in those muscle spindles, it's going to tear your muscle. Absolutely will create because it's going to create a concentric contraction. You're already going to be at concentric failure, and that muscle is going to pull against itself and snap. Okay. So that's sort of how you get injured with blood and guts. With high volume, how you get injured is you cause wear and tear on the joint, and the joint loses range of motion as you go, through something, 50, 60 sets or whatever. And correct. And so the high volume approach, the bro split approach, is you are putting all your volume, set volume and rep volume for a given body part in one day and just hammering it until you have wear and tear in the joint and acting insertions of the muscles. And eventually what happens is you go for a good, hard, intense push or pull and something just snaps, right? When the joint loses range of motion, you essentially are non-flexible, right? And so when you're inflexible in that position and you go into that sort of eccentric load, you're going to pop here if you've got all the wear and tear in your shoulder. Your chest is going to get pulled way out. Right. And when it gets pulled way out, it's going to detach. And so we see that all the time with people. A great example is the Tren Twins. Okay. If you ever follow them on social media, Mikey blew out his chest. And the reason he did was because he was pressing like 5 days a week. Okay. At high volume. And then he tried to do a 650-pound bench press and blew his chest out. Imagine. Right? Imagine you do 8,000 reps of bench press, and then on 8,001, for some reason, imagine your muscles just get tired and blow out. Right? So both of those approaches, I just want to say, are on the fringe. If you want to ask my recommendation, it is neither blood and guts and it is neither bro split. I do not like it. Okay. What I would say is you want to do something wise. Treat bodybuilding just like you would treat strength skill building. Okay. The thing you want to bring up, work it more, but more doesn't necessarily mean more sets in a day. It could mean more sets across the week total. Here's a great example. Most people could stand to lateral raise and rear delt fly 5 days a week. That would not hurt anybody. In fact, they'd probably be much healthier in their shoulders if they did it. Okay. And that's because your shoulders, if you do a few hard sets with your lateral and it's not really your lateral, your middle delt and your rear delt, okay, then it's going to recover the next day. Like, it's just, as long as you're reasonable about the weight you're using and you're not doing any kind of weird, crazy form, your shoulders are going to recover the next day in those small areas of the muscle, and you'll be able to work them again. And so if you want to buy shoulders, make sure you're getting shoulders in 4 days a week, but that doesn't mean you're doing 12 sets 4 days a week. And it doesn't mean you're doing one heavy set to failure 4 days a week. Instead, what it means is you're finding some kind of middle ground where you can get close to failure within a rep or two is great. And then you can recover effectively for the next workout and do it again. Okay. And so that's really, go ahead, Justin.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to, when we get to a stopping spot.
Oh yeah. So what I was going to say was just, you are using we're not auto-regulating. I don't want to say that, because in bodybuilding, that's the way to get wear and tear stuff happening. Okay. So we're not auto-regulating. It's a little easier to auto-regulate in strength because the different types of intensity that we're talking about here. But with bodybuilding, it really is a thing where you should start at the minimum effective volume, as in something that gives you a little bit of pump, a little bit of soreness from the novelty. You notice that it works the muscles, and begin adding sets as you feel you recover. And you may want to do something as little as just adding a couple reps here and there at first to see where you land, right? Don't make any big changes, and create a mesocycle where you're testing out what volume you need. Take 6 weeks to figure it out as you go along, because at the end of that 6 weeks, when you have an idea of what volume you can handle with what muscles you want to accentuate, right, and work on during that block of training, after 6 weeks, you'll know, and then you can hit it hard for the next few mesos, right?
Yeah. So, one thing that goes along with this really well, I think, too, is because you mentioned like the sides of the spectrum where you're like, you train the same thing once a week or you train it 5 days a week, right? And both are kind of on the edges. Doesn't mean you can never do them, but you have to have caution if you do so. A good middle ground that I think we end up with most of our programming probably is when you use the barbell and dumbbells and then certain types of movements, you're inevitably training other parts secondarily, right? So like, and then realistically, when you're doing it, like if you're dividing into like you have an upper pull day or something along those lines with that kind of split, you're going to naturally like partially train your biceps, and you're going to really train your biceps. But even on bench day, your biceps are going to get some stress. On a lower pull day, you're going to get stress in your biceps, and other muscles are going to be lengthened and pulled and things like that. And so like, unless you are using like heavily isolated machines, no barbells, no dumbbells, and even a lot of machines, like a lat pull down is not an isolation movement in the lat. It's like the lats are the primary mover, but there's like probably 5 or 6 other back like muscle groups we could identify that are also doing a lot of the work, plus your biceps, plus your forearms end up getting worked, and a bunch of other things. And often there's even like, your delts can also get some degree of involvement as well because of stability and other things. So all that to say, like, we don't have to worry too much about that usually with conventional programming where we're mixing free weights and machines, on any level, because you basically can't isolate to those extremes one way or the other. Like you can't, in like obviously, now benching every day, like you were saying, the Tren Twins were doing, that's a different thing because that's not an isolation movement,
right? And
you shouldn't do any compound movement every day forever unless you're doing it in excessively low volumes, or something along those lines. And of course, what's the point? But I digress.